Hello and welcome to episode number 17 of Performing Labor. My name is Rob Simons, and I am your host. This podcast features interviews with accomplished performing musicians who are doing interesting and creative work from within performing arts institutions and outside of them. We'll unpack their training, their practice, and their careers, how they got started, how they stay sharp, and their ambitions for the future. And it's my hope that these interviews will provide value if you're thinking about a career in music. If you're in music school now, a working musician, or if you're a music lover and just curious to learn more. My guest this week is Bharat Chandra, principal clarinetist of the Sarasota Orchestra, the Nordic Symphony in Estonia, and my colleague at the Cabrillo Festival of Contemporary Music in Santa Cruz, California. The Sarasota Herald-Tribune has dubbed Bharat both a philosopher and a rock star. The Oregonian has remarked on his bright tone, gorgeous liquid phrasing, and acute sensitivity. And the Miami Herald has placed him amongst the front ranks of clarinet soloists. And Bharat is a virtuosic performer, brimming with charisma. But as you'll hear in this interview, he's also a rhapsodic speaker and a creative thinker. In the few days since we spoke, I've been reflecting on his ideas, in particular, the distinction between how scrambling to return to concerts might actually be an easy way out, a coping mechanism that obscures greater opportunities. It's a substitution rather than a reform. In Economics 101 terms, a substitute good is one that anonymously satisfies the same basic want as another. Complementary goods, on the other hand, have a greater aggregate value when bundled together. And this idea stretches out to labor as well. And we touch on this idea a little bit in the conversation. In some contemporary accounting, labor is either substituted by technology or immune to it. But a more plausible outcome is that most 21st century workers will be complemented by technology, with huge potential productivity increases and breakthroughs on the horizon, in white and blue-collar work alike. In the orchestra business, I don't think we're threatened by robot flute players anytime soon. And I think there are great gains on the horizon for incorporating technology into our practice and our performances. However, I think the better way to think about complements, in the nonprofit performing arts sector at least, is with a bridge between the artistic mission and an explicit social function. Bharat mentions that a lot of these ideas around community and connection, we already have the right words on the tip of our tongues, but to date, we're largely ineffective in their implementation. And it's true that this is much easier said than done. There's a framework called public value that I've talked about on the podcast before, and almost certainly will again, by the Harvard Kennedy School of Government professor, Mark Moore. What Moore posits, at least on the surface, is that public and nonprofit institutions generate a public value that is an analog to private shareholder value, and that successful stewards of public resources are strategists rather than technicians. He goes on to say that they are, quote, explorers who, with others, seek to discover, define, and produce public value. Now, obviously, public value is more elusive than profit, and the process of searching for it is a rich vein that continually produces insights. Professor Moore warns that the instinct to strictly adhere to a core competency or tradition isn't necessarily a disciplined mission-driven focus, especially if it doesn't account for changing community needs and improving technology. I'm going to paraphrase Professor Moore here. We need to move beyond our professional training and traditional institutional perspectives, and the path from a hostility to change to arriving at an unforeseen new public value has many dead ends and U-turns. Some detours are self-serving, and some are just bad strategy. But the steward of these resources senses that there is value to be created for her fellow citizens. She asks, how is that financed? How is that authorized? In thinking like a private sector executive, the assets and capabilities of the organization can create new value. Our resources are not immutably fixed, nor is our mission set in stone. I believe that many parts of American civil society, orchestras included, have far more capacity to help alleviate some of the pressures that continue to build in our local communities and our nation. And as Bharat says, Orchestras are filled with optimistic and imaginative people. Going forward, we can think about our work not just as a summative expression of our artistic proficiency, but complement that with a formative and responsive approach. No doubt, there will be times when abstract and wordless music is still the best way to do that. But there will be other times when specific, direct, and flexible actions will be of greater contribution. I'll end with a quote by the philosopher Karl Popper. "The future is open. It is not predetermined and thus cannot be predicted except by accident. The possibilities that lie in the future are infinite. When I say it is our duty to remain optimists, this includes not only the openness of the future, but also that which all of us contribute to it by everything we do. Thus, it is our duty not to prophesy evil, but rather to fight for a better world." Please enjoy this interview with Bharat Chandra. Bharat Chandra, welcome to the podcast. Thank you for joining me.
Oh, it's such a pleasure, Rob. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, man. So it's mid-October now, and we're all looking forward a little bit to how we're going to get back on our feet as individual artists and our institutions. But I'm curious if you could take a look back a little bit about the last 6 or 7 months or so and how you adapted through that time as an individual artist. How was your practicing affected? Perhaps how was your teaching affected by all this?
Sure. Well, those are the big questions, aren't they? At least on an individual basis. I know so many of us have, experiences that are going to align and feel so similar and then branch off differently. My wife and I both play with the Sarasota Orchestra, as you know, and Anne is a violinist. So we sort of, had that first jolting experience together where we were in the middle of a concert cycle with a guest conductor, one of our, what we call Masterworks programs. It had four performances set. And after the second one, we got an email the next morning saying, this is over, So past that shock, the sort of reverberance, the waves, the ripples, whatever you like, that came out in those following days, they had a transformational kind of effect that was progressive, I would say, rather than immediate. So the first, I think, experience for us was just to be a little bit relieved that we had the chance to kind of watch what was going to happen, to see whether we were going to see something get worse or to see how political leaders would mobilize potentially to organize certain responses. In what ended up happening, I think we were more immediately concerned with things like our daughters, successfully finishing their school year. But musically, it felt fine to stop. It felt like the right thing to do. I think the more challenging component for me has been, how do you restart, and do you restart, and in what ways? And I know we're all still talking about that. Tell me more, Rob. I mean, are there aspects from that early time that you're particularly interested in or remembering in your own experience that are?
Well, so you jumped to the orchestra side of it, which is great. And so, for instance, for us, we got cut off in the middle of a education run.
Okay.
Actually, I don't think we hadn't even played our first performance for the kids yet, because it was midweek. We mobilized very quickly. I was very proud of my organization for doing this, to stream those concerts to more kids than we could have ever reached if we busing them in. Mm-hmm. And so in the blink of an eye, we went from having very little experience as a streaming organization to getting our product out to, I think, something in the neighborhood of 9,000 kids. Wow. And it was interactive too, right? So it was going into schools and the kids were voting on things. It was a voting theme and they voted on different instrument groups and stuff. And so as a surprise, making something bad or good out of a bad situation, we kind of saw a leap forward in terms of our organizational capacity right there. Mm-hmm. But it also, in the process of going through this, it revealed some strengths as inter-organizational communication, and also revealed some incredible deficits too. So anything like that kind of come to the surface for you with the Sarasota Orchestra in terms of the way your own internal mechanisms and perhaps, but then also I'm interested in how you as an individual, how has it changed your practicing? How has it changed your creative output? How have you used the time?
Mm-hmm. I'm so tempted to delve into something that's almost tangential to your question in terms of the individual parts, but I know we'll get to that. There are two quick but important aspects to our organizational response that I would like to kind of reflect on. One is that this is the positive one. We are wonderfully supported by our community here, and I think that's due in largest part to the personal relationships that have been created between musicians, donors, and I guess general audience members, however you would categorize that. We make a strong effort here, even in regular times, to go out into the lobbies before concerts, at intermissions, and circulate, talk with about whatever comes up. And I think that that's gone a long way to having a group here that cares about what happens to not just the music, but to us individually. So when the seriousness of the situation and the potential length of the effect started to become more clear, especially for organizations like ours, we have been able to rely on just an incredible sense of community support, really wonderful people who want to see us able to do the best we can. The second side, which is a negative any way you cut it, but has some underpinnings that I think will relate to how we reassemble. We were not equipped as a streaming orchestra at all. The things that we had done here for television or that type of production were very limited. Contractually, we've had the possibility to do it, but it's just not been something that we had typically taken advantage of. And so the lack of material that we had available to present to our audience just at that quick juncture was staggering. I mean, it was disheartening. It was something where immediately you're thinking, oh my God, we have to have this mechanism in place in the future. But of course you're dealing with right now. So our orchestra did create a sort of musical postcard project called Music Moves Us, where any number of individuals created little musical vignettes and loaded them up onto the orchestra website. And in some cases, people were just talking about their families, kind of introducing viewers to their lives a little bit, and then playing something. There was a very sincere and I think successful, for the context, effort. Having said that, the need to reach out the way we are, even exemplified by what you're doing in your many projects that I know about, including this, that need surprised us, and it was a negative surprise in realizing how far behind we were with what we would want to be able to do if we could wave a magic wand.
Mm-hmm. Were you a leader in this interpersonal stuff? It strikes me that perhaps you were a driving force in the pre-COVID interaction with audience members and donors. I mean, was that a musician-led effort, or is it an organizationally led effort?
Absolutely. I would say it's both. That was a synergy that felt great from the very beginning. I do lead a group of people that meets before all the Masterworks concerts in the lobby. We don't own our hall currently. We're working on creating one. And so the way we organize these things does depend on our venue a little bit. But where we are in our most familiar big concert space, lots of musicians will come out and circulate.
Yeah, it's interesting. And so you guys, I had forgotten this, you guys are building a new hall, correct? Or you're trying to?
We're trying to.
In Louisville, before I left, a new venue was built. The Kentucky for the Center is a public organization, and it has a private board in it. It has a politically appointed board as well. But they own 3 venues downtown. They built a new one. Mm-hmm. And it's a purpose-built, multi-purpose theater that's like 1,000 seats, standing room and seats. And Teddy Abrams, my former boss, he moved heaven and earth to get technology built into that building. And,
yes. Fantastic.
Now, in retrospect, that's paying huge dividends in terms of what they're able to do technically this season. Do you think that this will influence perhaps the blueprints of the new building to incorporate to build in the technology that it would take to become a broadcasting orchestra?
Rob, there's no doubt. And I think that even before COVID hit, we had concerns about how you design a space into a community whereby people who don't necessarily have an investment or even an interest in the orchestra, and people who may never have an interest in the orchestra, might come upon, something that we're doing and have very easy access to it. I mean, the most local example in Florida is the way New World Symphony created wall casts outside of their building. For those who aren't familiar with it, it's a giant projection and an architectural column of hundreds of speakers that allows people just in the neighborhood to occasionally just put down a picnic blanket and sit and listen and watch what's going on. I noticed it during a trip to Vienna. Outside of the State Opera House, they were projecting what was going on inside, broadcasting it the same way, and there were women with baby strollers and people standing with a beer and going over to a sausage cart and turning that locale into a little event. And it felt wonderful, just for not even for the art, but just for the sense of community that was immediately there. So our efforts, I think, were always going towards, yes, technology, but community integration, such that we're not creating a natural barrier, physical, emotional barrier to what we're doing inside. And this has only heightened that urgency, I think.
Mm-hmm. Is there any pressure on you guys to open up a little earlier, given how cavalier your governor is with the reopening? Because here in New York, I'm here in Monroe County, we've done really well in terms of, but we also have a lot of restrictions, and we learn from what happened downstate in New York City. So we've never really seen a huge outbreak here, and as far as I can tell, we're planning on keeping that. But part of that is that we still have a 50-person capacity limit. Mm-hmm. So there's no pressure on us to bring people in the audience. Are you finding that as an organization, you feel any pressure, external pressure to do that?
The direct answer to your question is no, because our management actually handled this part of things just brilliantly, I think. And I will go into that a little bit, but I will add that there's a tag on the end of this. There's an unanswered question that I'm sure we're going to discuss more about what happens next and what should happen next. And I have some strong thoughts on that might not always be in line with some of my peers, or maybe they are. I guess we'll find out even in talking with each other. Our orchestra planned to have no ticket sales. So essentially during the bit of off-season that we have over the summer, I mean, it's very swampy here for a chunk of the year, and most notably in the summer, they connected with their donors and they basically said, listen, we need you. We need to create a safe environment if we're going to do anything at all. And we want to support not just our musicians, but our staff from top to bottom, the people that have invested in the life here. Can you help us make this work, with the expectation that we won't have any concerts at all? Mm-hmm. So donors came through. We were able to really call on them. That relationship that at large we built up really came through for us. It's something that's humbled and made us very emotional in thinking about. We were able to basically take a 20% salary reduction for the year, and with the idea that we would do the concerts that we could as they became safe. And so now we are doing concerts with just string players who can wear masks, and we are doing reduced capacity in the hall that we own. That's a smaller facility. And we are experimenting with ways to keep everybody absolutely safe. But, that's going to bring me to another subject, and that is what we ought to be doing as orchestra musicians, or even as individual artists. And I don't know if you're ready to dig into that.
I am indeed ready to dig in. Let's go for it.
Yeah. Rob, I am not sure. I have to tell you, I'm not sure that we really should be playing concerts the way we're playing them. For me, there is a fundamental element of the concert experience that involves every aesthetic. It's the number of people, it's the room, it's the program. Yes, it's the conductor, it's the clothes, it's the smell, it's the time of year, it's what's coming up culturally for any number of people. It's I could go on. It's everything at once. And the experience of being in the room for a concert, yes, it's a musical one. It's a communicative thing in all these respects, but it is also very often an escape for people from their stresses, from their regular lives. And I am struck by how we are not really able to deliver that same thing, not just because of there being fewer people in the room or, even masks, but because the cumulative effect of it is to say, we're going to try to do this in spite of the circumstances. In other words, to me, the experience of this sort of COVID related concept never lets you get away from the worry of the virus, And so I'm not sure that that's the right answer. I know that it's important to a lot of people, and I think I'm in the minority. And I'm not trying to advocate for no concerts, but for me, it's a time that we ought to be absolutely blowing up the entire model of what we're expected to do as artists, and consider absolutely anything in order to reach the community in the best ways we can. I can say a little bit more about that, but was I too vague just now? I mean,
what I want to understand, so that I'm 100% clear, is what you're saying that chamber orchestra concerts that provide let's say a 60-minute performance via the internet, is what you're saying is that waters down what the concert experience is over the long term, so that, or is what you're saying that we should put everything on hold, brainstorm like crazy, and figure out where we could have real impact when we come back? Let's save the half-hearted stuff for the last possible scenario. There are probably better solutions we're just not seeing because we're going to the easiest solution first.
Rob, that's exactly it. I was in preparing to talk with you. I was sitting at my computer, and I was letting my mind really go in every direction it could. And really, don't ask me how I came to this, because I am not often at the National Institutes of Health website, but I was, and I ended up reading a bit of a paper by a gentleman in the UK. Which talks about, I'll read you the title: Psychological Factors in Exceptional, Extreme, and Torturous Environments. This was the result of a question that I had about the mind. Something I was wondering about: what happens in the mind when it's undergone a certain amount of pressure, and we hear stories of people breaking into fantasy a little bit. This wasn't necessarily just for you, but something that I've been kind of interested in learning more about. Without going too far into that, the abstract for this paper, I think, informs a very important subject related to what we're talking about. This author writes, "Our cognitive system has adapted to support goal-directed behavior within a normal environment. An abnormal environment is one to which we are not optimally adapted, but can accommodate through the development of coping strategies." So right there for me, that idea of coping strategies, that's where I feel like we, not that we make an error, but that's where I think we have to look very plainly. To me, a concert with a ton of distance, with a lot of masks, with a limited audience, and I mean in-person ones more so than streaming, that's a coping strategy. It's not a stunt, but it's a contrivance in order to do something that seems normal. And my position is it can't seem normal. It cannot deliver all of the things that it needs to deliver. Now, I can completely respect the argument that you do it anyway, because that's fundamentally what you're designed to do. There's music there. There are people who want to see it, even if it's in a smaller group. So give it to them. Great. But I think that there's an opportunity that's lost if we're not dreaming a lot bigger. And for instance, the orchestra is in almost every city, whether it's a big orchestra, small, it's a bunch of idealistic people that have sacrificed, potentially lucrative, fancy or other careers in order to basically do good for their community. They experience music like most people do, as an emotional nourishment, as something that gave them chills, gave them incredible excitement, passions, everything you can imagine. And they, at some point, internalized that and developed a drive whereby they could give other people those same emotional experiences as a gift over and over. New people can come in and we can try from zero, from new every time to create that moment for them. And every time we create it, it's different, but it's always with that goal, I think. Mm-hmm. So I think when you boil down that idealism, you're talking about people that are ready to do good. And in this circumstance, the coping strategy behavior for me it falls short a little bit. The idea of goal-driven behavior is where I want us to get to. So what are our goals? Connecting with audiences. So you write letters. You maybe take a chamber ensemble to them. You volunteer with them at an organization where they are already working. Maybe you uniform your orchestra in some visible way so that people know who you are. I don't mean in tuxedos and things, mm-hmm. but maybe you get a branded type of casual uniform and go out and become a little Peace Corps. Become a force in your community that's there to do absolutely everything you can, including music, but not restricted to music. And to me, that seems like an opportunity that we've probably never had before, where you can go into a community not with the intent to make them sit down and listen to you, but with the intent to just be of service. That could be defined better than I'm doing it right now, but I think it sort of cordons us back into the idea of goal-driven behavior, which is very normal for us, rather than what I do think is ultimately a bit of a contrivance with
I think it's really well said, Bharat. I think that, and whatever edges we can file away on this to make it a little clearer, I think it's great. It'd be great for me too. There's one thing I learned working again with Teddy in Louisville, again, pre-coronavirus though, is if you imagine this space in between your level of absolute tolerance at the top, and then at the bottom, this level, like this threshold of learning, when you get above that place, you're getting into unfamiliar territory, and eventually you can cross into a place where you just can't stand it anymore. And that place in the middle is the disequilibrium. And in there is where it can be really uncomfortable, but learning can really take place. And I think it's a really interesting concept that what you're talking about is that there may be this sudden burst of learning, technical learning, breaking
yes.
through with the broadcasts, but it's essentially the status quo, and we don't break into a learning space. And perhaps it's a missed opportunity. Of course, not being able to be together is a constraint that we haven't been able to figure out. But what I really want to do is drill down and push you on. If we're going to be in that learning place where we're going to question some of our values around, let's say, the supremacy of this music or the quality, I often think that quality is like a binding constraint, and that it affects everything we do. But I don't know how much any of us really believe in it. So it's kind of got like this passively in the background, but it's never really front and center. But yet it is our like overarching principle, and it gets in the way of these conversations about utility and about service. So I like that book, Robert Putnam's book, Bowling Alone, had a huge impact on me. And it was written in the early 90s, so it's not new. But the idea of institutions being what he called binding and bonding institutions, that they can either bind populations together or bridging, I think is what he called it. So bridging and bonding, that you can bridge divides and you can bond communities together. How, in your sort of pie in the sky, post-COVID, post-vaccine world, how does an orchestra be a binding and bonding agent?
Okay, so, post-COVID and what do you say, during COVID, we're still there. I go back to an idea that I learned in graduate school. Now, you'll notice from my name or from how I look or whatever you see that I'm half Indian, or you might think I'm Indian. My father was Indian. My mother is German English. And I was not brought up with, an exposure to Indian classical music. So I wanted to study it a bit in my graduate work. And I had a wonderful professor who's since passed away. His name was Peter Rowe, really beautiful human being. And the thing I remember him emphasizing the most is something that I've come back to during this and which comes to mind as you ask about post-COVID. In Indian classical music, there's this idea that all music exists in the heavens in perfection. All possible music, everything that we've heard and everything that could be. And that the player, he or she, draws this music down from the heavens with their practice. You were talking about quality. You're asking about quality. We spend all of this time, as so many people know, as musicians, in a room ourselves, looking to carve out exactly the right amount of space for the good and restrict everything that could pollute what we're trying to do with the music. So these musicians, they draw this down, they practice it for however long they need. And Indian classical music says that the expression of this, the performance of this music, once it's turned into sound, it goes out into the air, the vibrations come out, and it is fundamentally imperfect at that point. No matter how much the musician has given themselves to perfecting this incredible thing, to bring it from the heavens into actual sound, it is imperfect as soon as it leaves their fingers or vocal cords, or as soon as it leaves them. When the audience receives this music, if the music has been given with sincerity, with all of that honest love and work, practice, the music reassembles itself inside the listener and travels back up into the heavens in perfection. This cycle to me is everything about what we do. So it's during COVID, it's after COVID, it's about goal-driven behavior or coping mechanisms. It's everything. So when we talk about quality and how we do it and whether we reach it and is it important in what we're producing, for me, that constant pathway of the sincerity of the effort, the willingness to create, just for even not just the performance of the music, but the programming, the organization of it, the staff setting up chairs, the entire endeavor for the concert experience. This is going to come out imperfect, but once we deliver this to them, whatever that is, in this case it's music, but it may be other things for us now. I don't know. It may be a combination of things. When that reaches people, that is what nourishes them. That's what becomes perfect. That is quality. And that's what we draw from when we start this process in the beginning. So I realize that might sound a little bit vague, but when we talk about post-COVID, for me, it's about incorporating everything that we've learned. I mean, on a technical level, it is about having the ability to stream. In our community, we have a lot of older people that have loved the orchestra, who've been audience members and physically can't get to the concert hall anymore. So they in some cases live in community settings where if we had the right equipment, we could potentially beam ourselves in there. Mm-hmm. We could even dedicate, full orchestra concerts to just one group of people if we wanted to. If that were to make them special, or a series that could go out in many ways. I think that the efforts that we're talking about post-COVID will be different, and hopefully more complete, more creative. But I think that the process is fundamentally the same, and wherever that process breaks down, that's where I think we're talking about being in a sort of a coping strategy mode instead of a goal-driven.
Yeah. So what comes to mind for me is, I've been talking on this podcast a lot and been thinking about it a lot, is this, and it's not original to me, but this idea that the coronavirus has accelerated our life, maybe 5 years in the span of 5 months, or 10 years in the span of 7 months, or some whatever it is like that.
Mm.
And that has a lot of really interesting implications as you think it through. And I was doing some reading recently on disruption in work, pre-COVID again, but and in the 1930s, John Maynard Keynes talked about technological unemployment. So predating Andrew Yang's candidacy by 100 years or so. Not that we haven't been thinking about how machines can replace us. We've been thinking about that through our history, but that idea of technological unemployment. And if you think about how when we come out of this, that a lot of people and a lot of organized labor like ourselves will find a world that has moved on without us. Mm-hmm. I think that that's probably not going to happen to us specifically, but what might happen is society will have left us behind because we haven't made enough efforts in the area that you're talking about, in a country wrestling with huge demons around racism, misogyny, economic inequality, that the need for this dainty little music is going to
Right.
see much more on the periphery than it did before. And I'm super interested in talking more about the places where, outside of our silly little uniforms and our tuxedos and outside of the concert hall, where can we get into places and make meaning in our communities' lives?
Well, Rob, if I could jump in quickly, I love how you're thinking about this. I think it's essential to how all of our thinking will have to travel in the months ahead, years ahead. But just jumping back, I think both of us remember well a time when the recording industry was much more dominant in classical music than it is now. In fact, I remember it somewhat towards the end of it. I was a fellow at New World Symphony, and we had an executive from Deutsche Grammophon come in and talk to us about recording compact discs. That was the thing you did then, CDs. And he said, if you could promise me that we would sell 3,000 copies of a CD, DG will make it. We'll produce it for you. Promise us 3,000 copies. That was it, a minimum. And he was obviously trying to shock us into realizing that was the falling end of that business model. And concurrent with that time, I remember talking to recording artists. One of my teachers in graduate school was a big recording artist, still alive, wonderful man. And I remember asking him, what's going to happen? You've made so many CDs and your albums. This is a big part of your career. And he was so much more calm about it than I expected him to be. I really thought that he would have some philosophical worry and big thing to say, but he wasn't worried about it because he believed what I'm trying to circle back to, and that is that it's always about that in-person experience. It's about that experience in the room. And not to, beat this horse too much, but, coping behaviors. So the experience in the room is not doable the way we want it to be. So let's talk about streaming. I mean, streaming is a great way to reach out and safely, play for people that might know you. And I think that is a great thing for organizations to do. But having said that, when you look at it very coldly, there are amazing versions of just about everything out there, except the very newest music that people can access and they've been able to access that. So what is the thing that makes it special? It's always the local thing. It's always the connection. It's always that human relationship that's been built up. And this is what I'm trying to get back to with your point. I mean, when you say we might get left behind, these people playing dainty little, music, they'll care if they care about us. And that's why I think that's the goal-driven strategy at all times, is this sincere good effort, the sincere creation of something. You intend it to be perfect. It won't be perfect. But if it's meaningful to the people that you're working for, they will ride with you. They will hold you precious even when you're not playing the music that they necessarily love the most. And so these opportunities now, to me, are building every bridge that's possible. And preferably not doing it with sterilized versions and watered down versions of what we've done before. I really love this idea of being on the lookout for coping mechanisms and not confusing that with progress. I think so.
I feel that, we're in a time of great change right now, and I don't think that any particular event sets anything in stone, particularly around an election. But I do think, as an American, I would say by many identities, as an American, as a New Englander, as a husband, as a musician, as a union member, the main identity that gets activated for me is as an American. And I see that so much of our society is managing our decline. And I kind of refuse to accept simple managing of decline. And I think that is maybe synonymous, or at least a close cousin to your idea of a coping mechanism.
Rob, I agree so strongly, and I think if we veer into politics even for a moment, there's something very I think non-controversial, if such a thing exists anymore. And that is that there's a hunger for people to just say, let's take give me the best liberal ideas, the best conservative ideas, the best whatever, however you characterize them. Try them out. This is what we do in chamber music. This is what you do in a team sport. When you're in organized practice, whether you're a child or an adult, a professional, you're going to have arguments. And we work to try, especially in music. We say, all right, you don't like this tempo, or you feel that this timing comes across as too grand and subverts the big moment that's coming later. Let's practice it wholeheartedly each way. Can we convince ourselves that this could be possible and follow it to its end? And if it doesn't work, be willing to let it go. Be willing to shed the ego, shed the constraints that were on us at the time when we were arguing so powerfully for whatever idea we had, and let it be what it really is. And I think that politically, culturally, as you say, we don't want to just manage decline, and we don't want to manage, music production being something that is just a bandaged up kind of, hobbling along a version of itself until it can get to its former glory. Mm-hmm. I think we've got to be willing to say it can be quiet. It can be quiet for a time. The music will be there, and we will be there. We're in it every day, even at home, as you point out. How do you practice? How do you do this? Musicians are musicians. We're there, and people want to hear it, and they will find it, and we do have to give it to them. Obviously, I'm talking so maybe forcefully about my version of this, but I completely recognize that there are other wonderful ideas about how best to utilize.
No, I think you've hit on something that, or at least has come up on this podcast before with our summertime colleague Matt Albert, was talking about how he thought that the main thing that he's teaching when he's teaching chamber music is how to build consensus. And how do you it's a very liberal, like a liberal democratic idea of how do you tolerate each other, how do you work together even if you can't stand each other's ideas. And I think that right there is a way that organizations that are performing arts organizations specifically can bring people together just by assembling people under the roof of one of your city's flagship buildings, right? These big temples to arts is one way of doing that. I did want to circle back just real quickly to the CD thing. And I remember, because you're talking about that, it's ancient history, but I do remember when we were coming up that people talked about CDs as digital business cards.
Oh, yeah.
But implicit in that is that it's not really a viable artistic product, right? That nobody cares. And I think that also is the small thinking that you're talking about in terms of not brainstorming and thinking about ways out of ideas. And so I do want to start talking a little bit about differentiation from where we are to where we're going. So if you imagine on a graph, there's an x-axis that has better, different by being better, which I think you were talking about quality perhaps. And then on the y-axis is differentiation by design or differentiation by how it looks, or differentiation that it functions differently than what came before. Mm-hmm. So I know that my own experiences, I've talked about this on this podcast too, that I think temperamentally, I am an institutionalist. I believe deeply in working together, and that as a union member, as a member of an orchestra, whatever, we're going to accomplish more together than we will as individuals. Mm-hmm. And so I derive a great deal of satisfaction from being a member of the Rochester Philharmonic.
Yes.
But where I spend that capital is not on stage. I do the very best job I can do every week, I promise. But where I spend the capital is kind of getting out there with people the way you're talking about. So I love finding the person that looks the most alienated in the hall. And I go find that person, and I bring my violin and I sit down and I talk with them and I play a few notes and going through. But what I don't know how to do is how do we institutionalize this behavior? How do we take it out of the concert hall, bring our status as members of a flagship legacy institution in our city to a place where people are maybe not apathetic towards that, but maybe a little indifferent. I don't know, but it means something. and
Mm-hmm.
you provide some value to them, like through education or just spending time or listening. What are the
Mm-hmm.
places that you've had success outside of the concert hall that you'd like to build on?
That is, well, my mind is now turning to trying to answer that last part of the question. But before I try to do that, what you're saying to me is absolutely the bullseye. If I could just comment on that for a minute. We have the language, the jargon, the paragraphs, the marketing materials. They all say the things that you're talking about. So it's there. I'm not trying to dismiss them, completely, but the language is there. The idea of getting into the community or connecting with new people, that's been in our industry, and it goes around all of our buildings. We all say, and I think we all believe that that's important. But I think when you make that example of, I'm going to seek out this person, I'm going to go connect with them, how do we institutionalize that? That is it. And I don't know that I have a great answer for it, except to say that what is it? Maybe it's like a child when you're trying to get them to swim without their floaties, if you do that kind of swimming. Or maybe it's it's something else you can visualize where you're encouraging somebody to step into something that's a little bit scary. One thing that we could take care of as musicians, and this is putting it very positively from our side of things, is we could actively break down the perceptions that exist. I think largely from the past and from generations of musicians before us, not to paint them with one brush, but where I'll just be blunt. I've had board members say to me when we've had conversations about this type of thing, can we reach out in a completely new way, something we've never even dreamed that we could do? I've had them say, well, would the musicians do it? We have service counts. We have contracts that describe what a service means and what you do. And, I understand that. There are many people who I respect who play wonderfully and sit in orchestras and do an amazing job and have carried the torch for a long time, who, if you ask them to go do something that's completely, not music related in their eyes, will balk and say, no, this is not the time anymore. Well, I think those days are gone. And I don't think it means that managements, should be just assuming that any idea they have is going to be embraced. But I think that when we sit together, which we inevitably do, whether it's creating a contract or having meetings about how we're going to handle COVID or handle the death of one of our players or, the lack of interest in a certain series that we're doing or the overwhelming interest in how do we make more of this. When we're meeting together, I think that in the same way we publish those marketing materials about outreach and efforts and community and solidarity, that we give language and conversation and real effort towards, inching towards the deep end of the pool, inching into the uncharted territory, being willing to turn a service from a 2.5 hour musical event into something where you are going to go volunteer at a food bank. A lot of people might do that one, but when it gets a little more murky, they might say, no, that's not for me. I don't want to disparage those people, but I think that the answer in a long way to your easy question, how do you institutionalize the instinct that you have as a person, which I think is so beautiful? The answer is you have to talk about it and you have to bring it up in every single instance where you are meeting together.
I want to talk about two things, but I know that you have an interest in solving intergenerational problems. You set up an organization to think about how to bring that together, which I do think is a bit of a bipartisan issue. I just read Ben Sass's book actually about the vanishing adult. Where he identifies basically the car as a liberating event for young people that creates youth culture. Youth culture created a separation from the rest of society, and then that created this thing that's unique in human history, which is the separation of generations. So we have, our institutions serve infamously the very old or the older folks, but we, as you know, anyone listening to this podcast probably knows, we spend a lot of time with kids.
Sure.
So we already have the capacity and the infrastructure in a way to bring intergenerational folks together. Talk to me about why that's important to you, how we might, what things might be solved by doing that, and how might it benefit the institution in doing it?
Well, I think thanks for asking about this. The easiest thing I can pull out for your great question is imagine us, 30 or 40 years from now, Rob. And in fact, listeners that are tuning in, imagine how you'd characterize our national discourse right now, but not just that. How about our national attitude towards each other? I think it would be hard to characterize our response to safety nationally as patriotic. I don't know how we missed that opportunity. Well, I mean, I have some theories, but that we have not responded to this situation collectively with an effort towards each other that is, I respect you, you are an American, even if you're not an American, you're a human being with me right now, and I'm going to do my best to elevate you, protect you, and you do that for me. This is an idea we all, I think, would say we have, or at least most of us would say we have, but we are mostly not acting like that. So what do you do 30, 40 years from now when you're talking to someone who maybe grew up after this is over? Let's say we get a vaccine and we luck out and we don't have this kind of a worldwide situation for a good chunk of time. Let's say someone gets to be our ages roughly after this, and all they hear is that this is something that happened in the 20s, right? The value of the lessons that we are absorbing right now should not be lost on generations ahead. I don't think they need to be, beaten over the head with these things. But, our efforts between connecting kids and elders, as we call them, seniors, they're all about just the dialogue that takes place as a result of the projects we give them. So the thing you're talking about is kids and elders through arts, and it's honestly, it's been dormant more or less for a while as we've gone through a number of things in our family. Ann and I created it, and it still exists. And we have a board, and we do some little projects where we can, as we can. But it doesn't operate on a big scale as some other organizations do, like Generations United. People can look into that. It's fantastic. It's run out of Washington, D.C., and it's a similar concept, even bigger than ours, I think. But our focus was, can you use the arts in any form to just get these generations together with common purpose? So if it's building something out of paper mache, or playing some music for each other, or making a painting, or making a movie, or learning how to take a photograph artistically, anything that you can design that gets these generations in a room together and gives them a project automatically opens up doors for communication about, communication that's overt, and then it also opens up communication that's quiet, where people are transforming their ideas about older people or younger people just by virtue of what's happening. So how do we deal with this in the future? I think it's absolutely going to be essential that we are able to give examples to younger people that help them skip ahead in line. No one wants to go through this again. I would think that even some of the most adamant hardline people that maybe protested against mask wearing, or felt that their freedoms were being violated, I know that there are probably some of those people who've lost someone to this disease, or maybe they saw their president get it, and they thought a little bit more carefully, and maybe they would, if given a clean slate, they would revisit those choices and try to act to make this thing over much faster, which everyone says it could be. So how do we let the future generations skip ahead in line and take those actions right away so that more of their lives can be spent applying themselves to the problems that shouldn't be as hard as this one is? The very, very direct answer to probably a bigger question, but yeah.
Also, if you think about kind of what you're saying about some built-in resistance to the kinds of structural changes within the organization that you've talked about, that if you do buy the idea that I brought up, that we are skipping ahead many years in the course of a number of months, we'll find ourselves on the other side of this with a possibly different environment. Yes. And those folks will be there right there with us. how do you think that some of our practices around hiring might change? So if you think that there are downstream effects, so if somebody, hypothetically, if somebody says they come back to work in September of next year, we have a radically redesigned season that's focused on like a more communitarian idea of the way institution is shaped by its city. And they say, you know, it's not for me. We go to fill their chair. We take that very seriously. It's one of the most serious things we do in our institution, time in and time out. I always feel very proud of my organization every time I sit on an orchestra audition committee. It's where I think we're most high functioning.
Yes.
When we go to change that, we're going to look for a little bit different model of musician. How might you speculate? I'm not asking for you to give me a white paper on this, but I just want to know, like, what are the things we might look for in new hires? And we would actually be able to write those things down with specificity.
I think it's all about communication. You know, thank you for not pressing me too much on the specifics, because we've seen, you know, examples. I think Anthony Tomasini wrote a piece in the New York Times, which was powerful and had powerful blowback as well. You know, I think any of us that have delved into this realize, anyone listening knows what a complicated question you're asking in a technical sense. It is. But communication is the answer. If I'm testing for musicianship, I'm testing for communication at some basic level. You know, there's a point where we transcend the technical hurdles or technical challenges, and we value, I think, to a person, the ability to communicate the music. You know, when you're taught to take auditions, it's, you know, make that committee, even though you're just one part, the rest of the orchestra is missing, make them feel like they're experiencing the piece. That's communication. How do you put words on it more finely than that? You can't. You have to go to poetry. You have to get bigger in order to get smaller. There's no way to really characterize what that means. But if we're hiring somebody new, how do we do it differently? I just wish there could be a really fair way, because I don't want to end up, with some type of machinery that, however well-intentioned, kind of churns out a category of hiring, or I should not a category of hiring, but a process of hiring that we end up regretting sometime down the road because it skews in a direction we didn't anticipate. I mean, you could say that we were already in that place, but, you know, the communication aspect, fairly ascertaining whether the person you want to bring into your team is ready to, when their instrument can't make a sound, figuratively, like right now, you know, my instrument sounds fine there in my room, you know, my practice room, but it doesn't make a sound with the Sarasota Orchestra right now. Is that person ready to communicate the rest? Are we ready to communicate the thanks for the donors in my town that are making me able to hold on to this job in my house for right now? You know, are we able to communicate with people, as you said? You talked. I'm not going to forget that example of, you know, looking at the person in the room at the concert who seems maybe the most distant from you in some ephemeral aspect, and then making a beeline to that person to bring them in potentially. Does our new hire have the natural desire to try to do that? I think we're in a position now where we can select for more than just the ability to play orchestral excerpts. And I don't mean to reduce it, but we've got a large variety of, you know, characteristics to pick from, and we do restrict ourselves from picking them. What about just the technical knowledge of some of the tools we're using now? You know, I don't know. Is that important? I would actually defer. I almost want to turn this around on you, Rob. I mean, what do you see as being needed in your orchestra? You're there in Rochester. You played all over this country.
No, I appreciate your asking. I agree with you that we have excess capacity when it comes to playing. I think in the culture, the classical music culture, we know that we have fewer jobs than there are people, and that most people play at a level that if the cards had gone just a little bit differently, they'd probably be in a more lucrative place in their life. Right, playing wise, for that matter. And I also, Yuval Levin, who's a conservative writer that I really admire. He has a wonderful book called a time to build. And he talks about the value of institutions and how why an institution can thrive is because people in it can find common purpose and a way to contribute. So they don't need to have Bharat's charisma, and they don't need to have my, let's say, like lack of shame when it goes to going to talking to anybody. Or there are other ways to contribute, like you say, technically, perhaps if you're a Pro Tools master, or if you've got some great expertise on marketing, and particularly like grassroots marketing, I think is something that we lack. And there's probably any number of ways that people could contribute. I do think, though, that classical musicians have to acknowledge that we are the outliers. I think to give ourselves some credit, I think orchestral musicians are the least outliers because we play for big audiences. Right. We have like a genuine audience. We sell a lot of tickets every weekend. I wish we could sell more. However, we have to recognize that I spend a lot of time, or at least I have over my career, with folks in the folk music business because I'm interested in that. And I'm interested in that also in a collaborative perspective. And so when I watch some of my friends and colleagues and acquaintances who make their living as touring artists, to your point, communication beyond the song is a big part of what you do. And going out on stage and just running through a 45-minute set or an hour set list is not the gig.
Never.
It's bringing people in a way that they feel so connected to you and you're that they can't leave that venue without buying something. They can't leave that without sharing your name with a friend. And I think that the fact that we have this expectation built in of this anodyne player it's accumulated to the point where it's almost a crisis. Like we're at like crisis level in terms of our lack of ability to communicate.
You are so right. It's so spot on. My mind is jumping to everybody must have been to, I don't know how good of a chef you are, but I'm an average chef. I've made a few dishes that I wish I could, reproduce and pretend was the way I cooked all the time. But how many people have been to someone's home, let's say, someone who is, and maybe they're not a great chef, but they had that moment where they were putting, they cleaned their house, their apartment, their whatever, their space. They cleaned their space. They put on nicer clothes at the end of the day after they prepared to have you come to their home. And they picked out a menu. They picked out ingredients. They went shopping for you. They're putting together something that they want to just share with you. Maybe they asked, if you have dietary restrictions, people do that. But maybe after that, they got creative and thought, I think this is going to be really good. We've had that experience where you come and you spend time with that person. You see what they've done to prepare for you. It feels good. You've reciprocated this before, maybe. You know what this feels like. You feel honored and you feel happy for them and you feel generous towards the future that you will maybe do this in return. You see what they're cooking. You look at the ingredients. They tell you about it. They show you how they've worked to, smoke the garlic beforehand so that it would have just this little flavor for something. And then you have that meal, and the way you approach the whole experience is transformed by the goodwill you have that started when you walked in the door. Maybe it even started at the invitation. And I think you're right. You talk about folk music. Sure. So everybody, you're right. There's no circumstance, I think, where you can go out and just, yes, the music does absolutely exist in its own. It can be completely wordless or wordful, and it will do what it's going to do. And we're so blessed for that. And at the same time, to recognize that part of the communication is this sharing, the willingness to show, not to guilt the person, not to make them feel that this is a gaudy experience that someone has gone to this overwhelming length for you and you should be, desperate to repay them. But just as a gift, we've gone and tried to share something that's special, something that is refined and more effortful than we might normally experience. That's a beautiful thing to do for a human being. And where we do it in music, we I think build the relationships that will carry us as far as we want to go.
One of the things that I learned from Ted Abrams is that around programming, you're really trying to make music for the place, right? And it's for them. And
yes.
and only the most cynical person, and I've heard them say this, that, it's kind of a cheap trick to do that. But I think that just goes to show the kind of indoctrination in our profession. And but what you get to, and you were speaking about this before in this conversation about the local side of it, that maybe not every place has the interesting history. Where I grew up in Boston, or Louisville has its own very unique musical culture on which to draw on. So sometimes, like here in Rochester, it's a little more difficult to find. I think up here it's about technology. I mean, this is a place built on precision manufacturing and huge breakthroughs technologically. So I think that's where our most fertile soil is. But yeah, to get into those ideas of shared values, establishing common ground with your audience and that they know that it's for them is a huge part of programming, I think. And it also gets into an idea around our relationships with composers. That we need them to be on the team too.
Yes.
And we don't need any more tone poems. I mean, we have this like cult of abstractness in our profession. And I don't want to say that you can't be abstract or write the piece that you want to write. But I do think, the musicians come from all across the country to settle in Sarasota or Rochester or Los Angeles or Boston. And we join those communities. And such as it is, I think we need to think of ways that we can bring in composers to that fold as well.
Rob, I couldn't agree more. And, you and I share an experience every summer that does this amazingly well. But would you agree that, let's say you do get the composer writing a tone poem, great, that's what's on the menu, but it works when you've established, what is it? It's a community narrator. It's not a narrator. It's a presence. There's a familial presence that you create for your community, and it's open to people who've never been there also. So it's not just the closed loop of who's normally there. But when you create something that's open and you develop a trust through your communication that I'm gonna give you this menu and it's going to be different, and the next week it's going to be something and it's varied. It might be completely new. When composers become part of that, you can take a tone poem, you can take something that's completely maybe foreign in language or construction to a listener, and they will trust you through it. They will follow through it. They will give it that fair hearing, they'll be open to it. And then the reactions, as we know, are just kaleidoscopic. There's no way to even understand how it can affect people, but to be that bridge and to double down on that type of format, as you say, bringing the composer into this process even more aggressively, honestly. It is the future. It's what we have to do, for sure.
This could very easily turn into a love letter to Cabrillo. And I do love that organization, as you do. And one of the things about it that I find most impressive is how well it knows itself and how it'll bend, but doesn't get thrown off course. And I think that if there is a place for the new tone poem, and I don't mean to disparage tone poems, but as an example of kind of abstract writing and abstract thinking, that yes, that place has built up the infrastructure and the trust, like you said, to pull almost anything off. I do think, though, there is a little difference between a summer festival and a home orchestra, just in terms of the scope and scale. When I was a member of, I'm not going to go into specifics because I don't want to say who it was, but a former orchestra has a competing music festival in the same city, orchestral festival.
Okay.
And the CEO of that festival once said to me, disparagingly, how many pops you guys do? That's you, but you're wasting these weeks. And I was like, man, we play to more people in a month than you guys do in a decade, right? There's a scale here that has to be filled. I think about, there's one of my favorite quotes of Pierre Trudeau, Justin Trudeau's father. He said, a country, after all, is not something you build as the pharaohs built the pyramids and then leave standing there to defy eternity. A country is something that is built every day out of shared values, out of basic shared values, maybe what he said. Anyway, I love that quote. I love that idea. And I think in a home orchestra, we have to think about those building blocks, those basic shared values, day in and day out. And I think it's probably some combination of, I think what you were saying is telling your city's story. When I think you're talking about narration, like we're telling the city's story through programming.
Yes.
But we're also interacting, like it's a dynamic interplay between people and the artists. And I think that's what we're missing with our current vision.
Rob, I think it can also go to, it can go further in that I'm going to say orchestras, but that's because we have the most natural format for this. But it can be smaller groups. It can be anything. It can be, when we're talking about students that are coming up through this, music students, they're going to be inventing all kinds of new things, and probably they're going to be daunted by the situation now. I think this goes for them too. We can invite people into our artistic endeavors, not just to be, to view them or listen to them participate as an audience member, but to inform the entire experience too. I mean, I think I like actually how you've elaborated that idea of a community narrator is telling the city's story or the community's story. Because the quote about, it's the pharaohs and this, you're right, it's built every day, or that idea is so true that it's built in day by day. So what if we are doing more to invite new stories into our actual artistic experiences? Maybe you're inviting a community member who is, I keep saying the food bank. Maybe you're bringing people who were volunteering during this crisis now, and you're doing a concert for them. But maybe you're bringing them in at the beginning of your concert to talk about what their experience was. Maybe the programming, as you say, which should be local, maybe the programming gets built to connect with exactly some of this work that's being done. I saw a beautiful video done by the Bavarian Radio Symphony, featuring a couple of musicians, a very good friend included, who went to just play a small concert. It was sort of like a rooftop atrium type thing at a hospital. People who were treating COVID patients, were able to come up and sit in an outdoor setting, and they just heard a little concert. And the thing that I loved more than anything about, and the music, they played beautifully, wonderful players, and the people and the nurses and in their scrubs, they were all smiles. But it was something else. It was the smiles on the players' faces that you could see on the video. There was nothing manufactured about it. There was nothing, it was just earnest. It was this feeling that they were in the right place, that they were giving the best possible thing they could at that moment to exactly the people who needed it the most. And we can't always do that exact thing. But as getting back to your point about the way we program locally and not getting cynical, not just, giving into the idea that that's cheap or superficial, but the way we program is the way we communicate, the way we narrate the event, the way we build trust with the talking that goes on before and after, every aspect of it. It is that city's story if we tell it that way.
Bharat, I think this is probably a pretty good place to wrap up on that note. We could talk about this all day, and I hope that we can circle back at some point, maybe during this crisis or maybe as we're coming out of it, to see where our respective institutions are and where we are respectively as individuals. But before we go, do you have any recommendations on anyone, what they might be listening to or might benefit from listening to and reading?
Oh, the thing that comes to mind immediately is I won't say too much because it's a revelation. It was for me. There's a book by Isabel Wilkerson called Caste: The Origins of Our Discontents. And I picked it up because I read a review of it. I had not read her prior book, The Warmth of Other Suns, which apparently is just
amazing.
Yeah.
It's amazing.
Well, I understand something of that feeling because what it reminded me of, Rob, I had never seen a walnut. When they fall off the tree. I don't know if you've seen a walnut. I hadn't been around a walnut tree before, I guess. But I picked up this, green thing. It looked like a thin-skinned, unripened, round lime or something, hard, but it had a skin on it. And when I realized that you could peel it back and that underneath was a walnut, I don't know. That was this summer. That was, I lived all of this time in my life, and I just learned that about walnuts. Anyway, I've never lost the metaphor. I feel like everywhere I'm turning, I'm trying to understand what the skin of the walnut is. And this book, to me, is that. It gets into something even larger than some of the racial currents and the racial battles, I guess, but the racial constructions and discussions and concerns. There's something that wraps around all of this, and it includes even more somehow. And I think that her writing goes right to that. It doesn't avoid the center of the walnut, but it really does cast something around the idea that was monumentally illuminating to me. I read, I don't know how many pages that at the beginning, and I told some friends I felt like a marionette, where I literally felt my arms I closed the book, set it down. It was my father's desk. He passed away a number of years ago, but I was, there in his wonderful study room where he used to write. I put down this book, folded it up, and got on my computer and just relentlessly tried to find a way to get some message to her or to her publisher to tell her how meaningful this was to me. Not even finished with it yet. That does not happen to me, Rob. And I wrote her a message, went back to the book, and I just can't say enough about how timely and how interesting it is, and how beautifully written it is. It's conversational. It's immediate. It's nonfiction might not seem like the place. You might want to go there, but a lot of people might not right now because of the way reality is. But this is a place you can go, and you will find something life-changing there. That's my recommendation.
Yeah, she's. I haven't read it. It's on my list. I have read The Warmth of Other Suns. It does say a lot about storytelling, though, right? The technique of storytelling to communicate something really powerful. Well, thank you for making time, Bharat. This is a really wonderful conversation. Give my best to your family.
Rob, I appreciate this, and thank you for doing what you're doing. You may edit out this chunk. It's your choice, but you're a person who I've admired very much in the time that I've known you, even at a distance. The way you carry yourself, the way you use your music and your person to bring people together is something that I think this country and this world needs a lot more of. So I'm honored to be on your podcast. Thank you for having me.
Well, likewise, Bharat.
Thank you, Rob.
Thank you for listening. The music on the show, as always, is by Craig Wagner, a guitarist from Louisville, Kentucky. We'll be back soon with more episodes. The next one features principal harpist of the Rochester Philharmonic Orchestra, Grace Browning. So please go ahead and hit subscribe.